Imagine a man who decides the fate of dozens of people a day with the simple bang of a gavel. A judge, dressed in black, sitting on a wooden throne above everyone else, speaking with the authority of one who carries the law in his hands. Charles O'Brien was exactly that, at least on the surface. For the town of Mangle Park, he was a symbol of tough justice, of unshakable morals. But behind the fine words and respectable demeanor, there was a dark secret. Charles used his position to enrich himself, and he did it in a meticulous, cold, and calculated way, as only a judge with decades of experience would know how to do. His weapon was not violence. It was sentencing. His motivation? Money. Money from the private prisons with which he maintained silent agreements. Every convicted defendant was more profit. The more young people he locked up, the bigger his bank account became. O'Brien didn't need to forge evidence or threaten witnesses. He used the system itself to his advantage. Heavy sentences for minor crimes, denial of bail even when the law allowed it, selective choice of prosecutors and lawyers. The game was dirty, but it looked clean. And the targets almost always had the same profile. Young black men, poor, without good lawyers, without a history of violence, but unlucky enough to come across him. Many didn't even know what they were facing until they heard the gavel strike. Guilty. 10 years. No chance of parole. And that was that. Life became a statistic. Charles was respected by the media, revered by politicians, and feared by his own colleagues. But no one dared question him. After all, he was the veteran, judge, the man who kept the city safe. But safety, in that courtroom, was just a cover for greed. Charles's victims didn't appear in the newspapers. They were the forgotten ones. Young people left in handcuffs while their mothers cried in the back of the room. Young people who lost years of their lives over the slightest thing, over flimsy accusations, over mistakes made when they were teenagers, and even when they were innocent, it was hard to escape. Because for O'Brien, prison was a business, and he couldn't let his profits dwindle. He even closed a public rehabilitation unit in the city, just to ensure that more people went to private prisons in another state. More time in prison, more financial bonus. It was a people-grinding machine disguised as justice. And all this was happening before the eyes of an entire city that, out of fear or ignorance, kept quiet. Until one day, someone came along who not only saw, but acted. Among the hundreds of young people condemned by Charles, there was one who stood out. Derek Porter, 29 years old, clean record, accused of involvement with drugs in a poorly explained case. Charles judged him as always, with coldness and contempt. He sentenced Derek to life in prison without hesitation. But this time, something different happened. Derek didn't cry, he didn't protest, he didn't tremble. He just looked into the judge's eyes and smiled, as if he knew something that Charles didn't. Because he did. Because he did. Derek Porter was no ordinary defendant. He was an undercover federal agent. Undercover. His arrest was part of an undercover operation to bring down the corruption scheme within the city's judicial system, and the main target was Charles O'Brien himself. For months, Derek lived like an ordinary prisoner. He slept in cold cells, ate expired food, heard cries of pain and injustice from all sides. But every minute, there was part of a plan. He recorded conversations, monitored prison guards, gathered secret documents. He knew exactly what to look for. Every note exchanged with judges, every irregular transfer of prisoners, every payment from companies that profited from human suffering. While Charles continued his power play thinking he was in control, Derek was putting together a dangerous and complex puzzle. The tables were about to turn, and the judge who had spent his life sentencing others would soon be on the other side of the bench. Derek Porter wasn't just an agent. He was a child of the periphery. Born and raised in a neighborhood forgotten by the government, he saw childhood friends disappear into the prison system. Many of them never even had the chance to defend themselves. This reality shaped his path. He decided to join the FBI not for glory or prestige, but for justice. And when the opportunity arose to bring down a corrupt judge who was feeding the imprisonment of young people like him, Derek didn't hesitate. He knew the path would be brutal, He knew he would spend months away from his family, living as a criminal, sleeping among thieves and murderers. But he also knew that it was the only way to put an end to decades of silent injustice. His arrest was carefully planned. The trumped-up drug charge, the lack of solid evidence, the bad lawyer. It was all part of the cover-up. Charles O'Brien went down as expected. He saw Derek as just another easy prey, just another body to throw in the cell. What he didn't know was that Derek was recording everything, from the interrogation to the trial. Every meeting between prosecutors, every awkward conversation in the hallway, every mention of private prisons, everything was being documented. Over time, Derek began to realize something even more frightening. Charles wasn't acting alone. There was an entire network of servants, businessmen, and politicians profiting from the scheme. The corruption ran deep, but he would keep digging. Inside the prison, Derek saw the true result of what Charles was doing. Young people destroyed, absent fathers, men who had gone in for petty crimes and came out years later as shadows of their former selves. He talked to them, heard stories that marked him forever. An 18-year-old boy who got 15 years for stealing food. A man who lost custody of his children because he didn't have a decent lawyer. Forgotten people, people who should never have been there. And all of it was feeding the same profit machine. Derek felt his anger rising, but he couldn't act before it was time. Every detail had to be in place. Every piece of evidence had to be indisputable. The mission was bigger than his pain. Outside the prison walls, a small team of FBI agents was working in secrecy, cross-referencing the evidence that Derek was sending in hiding. Suspicious bank accounts, transfers of prisoners without justification, court orders with altered dates. With each document, Charles's castle began to crumble. Even some of his fellow judges began to be investigated. But Derek knew the final blow had to be public, humiliating, unforgettable. It had to show the whole town who Charles really was, to show that the man who claimed to be a defender of the law was, in fact, the architect of one of the state's greatest injustices. And the ideal moment arrived when the prosecutor's office prepared the official indictment. That morning, Charles arrived at the courthouse as usual, dressed in a suit, confident, ready for another day of absolute power. But instead of going up to the pulpit, he was surrounded by 6 federal agents. The handcuffs shone under the light of the flashbulbs. Reporters jostled to record the moment. He tried to protest. He tried to say it was a mistake. But the avalanche had already begun. As he was carried away, he saw faces he had condemned staring back. People he had destroyed, now watching him fall. In the back of a car, for the first time, Charles O'Brien experienced the silence of someone who has lost everything. And at that very moment, in a private room, Derek took off his prison uniform and put on a suit. His mission was complete. But the final chapter was still missing: the trial. The Mangle Park courthouse was packed. Cameras, reporters, ordinary citizens. Everyone wanted to witness the outcome. After all, it wasn't every day that the town's own judge was about to stand trial. But what nobody expected was who would be in charge of that hearing. When the doors opened and the figure in the black suit crossed the hall, silence took over. It was Derek Porter, the same young man who months earlier had been sentenced by Charles. Now he was the new judge appointed by the mayor's office, recognized for his courage and integrity. The man who had spent months pretending to be guilty was now about to hand down his final sentence. Charles O'Brien entered in handcuffs, his face haggard and his pride wounded. When he saw Derek sitting where he used to be, he flinched. His world came crashing down. Not just because of the humiliation, but because of the symbolism. That was justice giving it all back. Every wrongful conviction, every ignored tear, every dirty penny, now reflected in the mirror of his fall. Derek stared. No anger, no arrogance, just the truth. He read each accusation clearly. Corruption, abuse of authority, collusion with private prisons, judicial fraud. His voice carried the weight of someone who knew the pain on the other side of the fence. But there was also hope. Hope that, on that day, something would change forever. Charles tried to defend himself. He claimed he was doing his job. He said that convicts were not saints, that society needed judges like him. But his words echoed hollowly in the hall. No one there saw him as a symbol of justice anymore. He was just a man trying to justify his own ruin. Derek listened in silence, and when it was his turn to speak, he did so firmly. He said that this trial was not about revenge. It was about responsibility, about looking your own guilt in the eye and not looking away. He remembered all the young people who lost their dreams behind bars. He remembered the mothers who never saw their children again. And he made it clear that this would not go unpunished. The sentence was read out with solemnity. 25 years in prison, plus a fine of $250,000. And as a symbol of reparation, 50 hours of community service per month for the duration of his sentence. In the audience, some people applauded discreetly. Others wept. Charles bowed his head, alone, no family, no friends, no support. The man who had once been feared was now escorted out by security guards. Justice had delivered its verdict, not just legally, but morally. The image of the man being led away in handcuffs remained etched in the memory of everyone who was there. It was the end of an era, and the beginning of another. Derek remained silent for a few seconds after closing the hearing. Then he took a deep breath and spoke, looking at everyone present. Justice is not a weapon. It's not a throne. It is a mirror, and sooner or later, everyone will have to look into it. The court rose. Outside, the city was beginning to breathe a new air, an air of change. Because that day, a symbol of corruption fell, but more importantly, a new symbol of courage and truth rose. And for those who think they are above the law, take a good look at this story, because justice never forgets.